In this question of faith and science, are they friends and foes? I think that one of the most influential questions is this question that has already been raised, the question of scientism. Next. Thank you. And I'll get the shameless advertising over quickly. And I became so frustrated about this belief. Scientism is the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is. I became so frustrated with the scientism of today's culture and much of the debate that I wrote this book about it. And my book explores the history of scientism, some of its justification, some of its very important distinction from science, and its cultural consequences. I experienced two reactions, immediate reactions, when I raise this issue of scientism. One of them is for someone to say, well, you know, that's obviously true. The other reaction is sort of equal and opposite. Well, it's obviously false. Now, when you have two reactions like that, you know that actually there's something here that is not obvious. And what is often not obvious is the very presence of scientism. And that's because it's very rare that anyone gets up and explicitly endorses scientism, says, I believe that science is all the real knowledge there is. Far more often, scientism is just a hidden, barely acknowledged presumption. But here's an example that I wanted to show in case that you believe that this scientism is a complete straw man and no one really believes this. Here's Alex Rosenberg. His latest book just came out. He's a philosopher at Duke University, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. He defines scientism in exactly the way that I do. He says it's the conviction that the methods of science are the only reliable ways to secure knowledge of anything. He goes on to say things like, science provides all the significant truths about reality. And in case you are in any doubt, he says, once you adopt science, you'll also be able to cease treating the humanities as knowledge. Actually, though, more often than not, as I say, scientism is hidden or just a background presumption. So, for example, Paul Thagard, in his book, The Brain and the Meaning of Life, says, what is reality? Those things and processes identified by well-established fields of science using theories backed by evidence drawn from systematic observations and experiments. Or Richard Dawkins, who doesn't argue, he just repeatedly asserts in his book, The God Delusion, things like the existence of God is a scientific hypothesis like any other. Next, please. So, to make sense of this discussion between faith and science, I think we have to understand what we're talking about. And in particular, we need to be very careful about what is meant by faith and what is meant by science. I'm going to spend most of this talk talking about what I think science is, because I think that's the most approachable question. But I'll talk somewhat at the end about what faith is and try to bring those two together. And the first thing to be clear about science is that there are two competing meanings of the word science. Once long ago, science meant simply any systematic study of a particular topic. In other words, science was, practically speaking, synonymous with knowledge. And long ago, that simply was its meaning. And it was even the case that some usages like this persisted into the 20th century. Now, the reason why that's important is because, of course, by this definition, scientism is practically speaking a tautology. I mean, if science and knowledge are simply the same thing, then it's true that all the real knowledge there is science. But that isn't what we mean today. That isn't the modern meaning of science. What we mean today is what once would have been called natural philosophy, and what we more commonly these days call natural science. It's the study of nature, that we think of in modern science as the inheritance of the scientific revolution. So that's what I mean by science, and I'm going to expound that. What I mean by faith, in short, because otherwise I'm going to not sort of have my cards up front if I say nothing about it, I'm going to mean basically Christian conviction and belief. And the reason I mean that is because I'm a Christian, and that's what I understand best. Of course, a lot of what I say may well apply to other religious faiths, but I prefer for them to speak for themselves. So that's basically what I'm going to mean. And you know, if we're talking about this question between science and religion, that's really what people are talking about, right? They're not talking about reconciling the gods and goddesses of Greek mythology with the latest theories in economics or politics. They're talking about the compatibility of Christianity or some other major world religion with a modern understanding of things like physics or chemistry, biology, astronomy, geology, and so forth. And of course, science and faith is a burning issue, a pressing issue in our society, and one people are very interested in, precisely because natural science has enormous epistemological prestige. People really believe what science says about its topics, and that's based in large part on its amazing growth and in a certain sense, success, as was mentioned earlier. I mean, I'm a scientist. I think science is terrific in the right place, understood correctly. So, okay, if science did still mean just systematic contemplative knowledge, then theology would still be a science. It might not these days be the queen of the sciences that it was once thought to be. But the truth of the matter is, when we're talking about science today, that's not what we mean, and theology is not a natural science. So, you might say, right, well, how do we go about defining or understanding what science is? Isn't science simply the study of nature? I mean, that's a very natural sounding definition or understanding of what science is. But I would like to suggest to you that trying to understand and define science as the study of nature is not a very helpful definition. And the reason is that the word nature is, if anything, more unclear as a concept than the word science. And the ambiguity of what we mean by nature has been recognized for centuries. This gentleman is Robert Boyle. He was one of the co-founders of the Royal Society, the first major scientific organization in Great Britain. And of course, you perhaps know him from Boyle's Law, although since this isn't MIT, you wouldn't all be able to tell me what it is, would you? Okay, no test. But he wrote about a whole lot of other things than science, and this was one of the things he wrote a book about. He called this book A Free Inquiry into the Vulgarly Received Notion of Nature. And in it, he lists 8 different possible meanings for the word nature. Actually, the meaning that he was at pains to advocate was the settled course of things. So he regarded that as being the best working definition of nature, and that is really the definition that we mean when we talk about natural science. So because this word nature is rather ill-defined, science, I think, is best understood not so much through its topics, in other words, what it studies, but rather through its methods. Next view graph, please. So that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time on, talking about science's methods, and we'll move to the next view graph. There's a great deal of philosophical controversy about understanding the scientific method as it's sometimes been referred to. And it's a pity that Dr. Müller is unable to be here, because he would be very knowledgeable about that. But nevertheless, I think science is rather well-defined and can be identified, at least intuitively, from its characteristics. Those distinctive characteristics are things like observation, experiment, measurement, and so forth. And I boil all of those characteristics down into 2 major characteristic approaches that science insists upon. And those are reproducibility, so that experiments, for example, or observations must be reproducible, and clarity, which is to do with the fact that science requires unambiguous descriptions and measurements. And I'm going to unpack those a little bit more, so we'll move to the next view graph, please. Michael Faraday was a fascinating character in 19th century science. He had practically no formal education. He left school at age 13 and was apprenticed to a bookbinder, where his real education occurred, reading the books in Mr. Rebo's shop. He has no less than 5 laws or phenomena of science named after him, which I think it may be a record. I don't know. I haven't, but it's certainly a remarkable record. Michael Faraday used to say that he had a phenomenal imagination, that he could imagine the Arabian Nights, and he was referring to thinking about nature, of course. But he said, facts were important to me and saved me. Without experiment, I am nothing. He was a great experimentalist in those heady days when electricity and magnetism and so forth were being discovered and explored. And it was said of Michael Faraday that whenever he heard or read about a new phenomenon that someone had discovered or observed in some other lab, the first thing that he would do is he would rush down to his own lab in the Royal Institution in London and try to reproduce it. And I like to think that this woodcut, at least in my mind, is representative of Michael Faraday in his lab at the Royal Institution trying to reproduce some experiment that he's heard about. But he did this because he knew in his bones that science depends on repeatability, that if someone does an experiment somewhere else at some other time, that he ought to be able to reproduce it in his own lab. Did that make Faraday into an arch skeptic? Far from it. He was a lifelong Christian. He was a member of an unorthodox Christian church, the Sandemanians, and he was actually the elder of that church for much of his adult life, and in that church that meant he was basically the preacher and visited the sick and so forth. No, it didn't make him a skeptic. Let's move on. Now, if you thought about this carefully, you might say, well, okay, that might be true for experiments, but what about observational science? For example, what about astronomy? Because after all, we can't do experiments on the stars. So how can reproducibility be an important part of those observational sciences? Well, yes, it can. Reproducibility is just as important in observational sciences. For example, in astronomy, different observers have to be able to observe the same phenomena from different places at different times. Or if there are unique events in the heavens, as there are on some occasions, and this photograph is supposed to be a representation of such a unique event. This is the Crab Nebula, which is the remnants of a supernova that took place on the 4th of July, 1054. If there are unique events, then you need more than one of them. And so there are lots of supernovae that happen, and with today's powerful telescopes, we can actually see them on a quite regular basis. And so repeatability is, in fact, present in an observational science like astronomy, and it is important. So reproducibility doesn't just mean reproducibility at will, as it is in principle, at any rate, for an experimental or laboratory science. But many things in our lives don't possess reproducibility. Reproducibility isn't present in lots of topics of great importance. And I usually take history as the best example of this. Only a tiny fraction of the activities of history benefit from analysis bearing the stamp of natural science. So how do we know the truth of the statement that Julius Caesar was stabbed to death on the steps of the Roman Senate, on the 15th of March, 44 BC? Not by science, not by reproducibility, not by experiment, or any kind of scientific evidence. But we do have evidence. It's not scientific, it's historical. History has real knowledge, yet history's knowledge is not, by and large, scientific knowledge. I won't dwell on it, but the same can be said of economics, in part because in economics you can't do a reproducible experiment on an economy, because that would be irresponsible for one thing. Mind you, that doesn't hold back some of us. Oh no, I shouldn't say that. Politics is another field, very, very important. But consistency and predictability, no, that's not part of politics. Pragmatism and public opinion is part of politics. So there are many different types of important discipline that aren't sciences in the sense that natural sciences. Now, of course, some of my colleagues will bristle when I say this, because they are assuming that I'm belittling their discipline by calling it a non-science. But they shouldn't bristle, because I'm not. I don't subscribe to scientism. I think scientism is a dreadful mistake. And if you don't subscribe to scientism, then calling something not a science isn't an insult. You might actually, be praising it. But the problem is that many of these non-scientific disciplines have been and still are influenced by scientism because of the power of the scientific viewpoint. Well, I must move on. Clarity is my other chief characteristic of science. And this is being used in a specialized sense. But this is a foundational requirement for the expression and communication of reproducibility. The results of an experiment have to be able to be expressed sufficiently clearly that I can actually tell whether that repetition has given the same results or not. Otherwise, it's going to be impossible for other investigators, or even for myself, to tell whether I got the same result on repeating the experiment. And the primary way in which people achieve this kind of clarity is by measurement. So turning descriptions of nature into numbers. And that is certainly a primary way of getting clarity. This means, for example, many of the theories of science become mathematical, and that's indeed an ideal of physical sciences. But actually, I think it's a mistake to think that all of science has to be mathematical. It doesn't have to be mathematical, because, for example, in disciplines, for example, like botany, field skills are extremely important ways of obtaining clarity, and a lot of attention is paid to them, but they aren't in any meaningful sense mathematical. Or if you think about physiology, the description of the bodies of animals or humans, that's not really mathematical, yet they do aim very much for this clarity. This, incidentally, is a copy of the International Kilogram. That is the last of the physical units that we still measure by reference to an artifact. All the others are measured by physical phenomena. But again, many vital topics that we have to deal with as people don't possess these kinds of clarity. And I've put up some examples of the kinds of things that don't possess the clarity that science calls for. They can't be turned into measurements or numbers. And the example I like to use most, I won't give you the actual audible representation, that would be too difficult in the present circumstances. But if you think about music, music can be represented with remarkable precision in terms of basically numbers, so it can be turned into measurements. And in digital recordings, we might think of ourselves as having a scientific description of a piece of music. But do those numbers of the recording represent the significance of the music? I don't think so, because music's meanings actually aren't present in some kind of scientific description in terms of vibrations of the air that excite my ears and are emitted by loudspeakers or instruments. No, they're elicited by the very act of hearing, by the connection of the music to the human. And they don't possess the kind of clarity of being able to be expressed unambiguously. So, next view graph. So, those are my two characteristics of science. And I want to return to the problem of scientism. Scientism has tried to inflate the scope of natural science governed by those epistemological principles into all of knowledge. But it's met with substantial resistance. And there is within the academy particularly, over the last 30 or 40 years, a whole trend which is, in a certain sense, a rebellion against and a rejection of scientism. And I don't want to understate the complexity of what the postmodern movement is. But one of its characteristics is that it is a rejection of scientism. So Jean-François Lyotard is a kind of icon of postmodernism, and often considered to be its representative and one of its first advocates and explainers. And here is what he says. Scientific knowledge doesn't represent the totality of knowledge. It has always existed in addition to and in competition and conflict with another kind of knowledge, which I will call narrative. Or elsewhere, he just simply boldly says, knowledge is not the same as science. So a way of understanding what has been happening, particularly in the humanities and the arts, in philosophy, in the academy in the last 40 years, that is often labeled postmodernism, is a sense that many academics in the non-scientific disciplines are up in arms to reject this scientism that has become so powerful. And I would say they are right. They're right to do so. I think it's a very justified reaction to scientism's pretended monopoly of knowledge. However, there's an unfortunate aspect of it, and that, at least from my personal scientific perspective, and that is that many people take this to extremes, and they end up rejecting science's own expertise in its understanding of nature. And this then provokes the science wars because the postmodernist says, you scientists don't really know what you're talking about, and we say, well, we do know what we're talking about, and so it becomes, a big argument. So the problem is when the postmodernist impulse leads out to throwing out the baby, which is science, with the bathwater, which is scientism. But I don't think that's actually necessary. I don't think it's important to do that. And one can avoid that problem if one distinguishes science from scientism. So let me just unpack scientism just a little bit more. Scientism is, in a certain sense, a philosophy, or perhaps the best expression for it is it's a worldview. So something that's a worldview tends to have things like a justifying narrative history, some kind of integrating cosmology, a lens or filter through which to view the world and interpret the world. It very often has a community of believers, of adherents, and those people look to that worldview as a source of their ethics. Now, I'm sure that those of you who are people of faith recognize that as a partial description, at least, of a religion. And these are the characteristics which are actually shared by scientism. I don't have time to unpack all of them, but let me say a few words about the justifying narrative. People sometimes say, well, okay, if scientism is so important, well, when did it really get going? Actually, it got going quite early on in the scientific revolution. But when did it become established is an interesting question. Here is one of the icons of the justifying narrative of scientism. This is Galileo. Okay, we all know about Galileo, who asserted that the Earth goes around the sun and got into trouble with the Roman Catholic Church for it. And this is a picture that depicts him. Look how heroic he is. He's in this pose, this heroic pose. And if you look carefully, I don't know how well this shows up on the projector, but if you look carefully, round his head, there is a light patch. In fact, if you think about it, that's actually a halo. So not only is he a hero, he's a sainted hero. And here are the people of the Inquisition They're half cowled and you know, embarrassed in a certain sense, perhaps in this picture, by what's going on. They're certainly in the dark and gloom. And in fact, if you look at this room carefully, what you realize is the light is coming from this side of the room, coming from the right-hand side of the room, and illuminating these folks and the wall behind. And in fact, it looks almost as if the light is shining out of the head of Galileo himself and illuminating this picture. The chief accuser in the middle has his finger towards a parchment, and there is a quill and ink on the side. Evidently, Galileo is going to be forced to recant. Now, actually, this shows a big part of the justifying narrative of scientism, which is a lot of which dates back to Galileo and earlier. But the interesting thing about this painting is not its content, although that's, I think, quite interesting and fun. The interesting thing about this painting is when it was made. It's actually not a 17th century painting, it's a 19th century painting. It was painted in the middle of the 19th century. And that was when scientism really became established in the academy. It was part of academia's battle to overthrow religious authorities in universities. And scientism was actually an important part of that strategic vision in that 19th century struggle. It was held up as a kind of ultimate enlightenment objective. In a certain sense, the objective was successfully achieved. I mean, our universities, by and large, in the West, are secularized today. So let's go to the next view graph. Let me just talk a little bit about the community of believers aspect. One of the more remarkable things about certain of the 19th century scientisms, which somewhat predate the establishment of scientism within the academy, is that they actually explicitly turn themselves into kinds of religions. So, for example, positivism, which is the best known type of scientism from the 19th century, its founder was Auguste Comte. He, in the later part of his life, founded, as part of positivism, what was called the religion of humanity. And this was literally a religion. People met once a week in kind of positivist churches. They had a hierarchical priesthood. It had public services. It had daily prayers. It had 9 personal sacraments and 81 annual festivals. This is, by the way, a still standing positivist temple from Brazil. So it went quite far afield. So quite remarkable that scientism actually had even some of the more clearly religious facets. Next slide, please. And the people who adhere to those kinds of worldviews look to the worldview for their ethics and for their morality. And this happened also in scientism, particularly in the 19th century. It took the form of social Darwinisms initially. For example, Herbert Spencer, who became astonishingly popular in America with his advocacy of laissez-faire capitalism based on an interpretation of evolution. Or a similar movement, but one that got going much more slowly and actually advocated practically the opposite of laissez-faire capitalism. It advocated advocacy for actively trying to help evolution along, eugenics, and led eventually to statements like this: it's better for the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Now, this wasn't some ranting redneck. This was a Supreme Court justice who said this in 1927. Quite remarkable. Now, eugenics, of course, came to an abrupt end as the civilized world recoiled from the horror of the Nazi Holocaust. But still, people look to science and scientism for their ethics, and that continues today. The rebirth of what amounts to a kind of social Darwinism in the 20th century, you could think about what's called sociobiology. This is Edward O. Wilson's term, and whose very famous book, Sociobiology, the Modern Synthesis, and On Humanity, well, winning him Pulitzer Prizes and so forth, applied analogies from social insects to humans. And these were backed up by evolutionary explanations, stories that seemed purported to put a scientific ethos on the kinds of moral and ethical decisions that he thought could be addressed. I mean, it's a good thing, in a way, that E.O. Wilson arrived at an opposite conclusion from the eugenicists. He said, well, we should, because the gene pool needs diversity, we should let everybody flourish. Okay? The eugenicists were saying, no, we should sterilize the unfit. Okay? But the truth is that they didn't come to those opposite conclusions for any good scientific reason. And Wilson himself was lambasted by some of his Harvard colleagues, biologists and atheists, actually, people like Gould and Lewontin, because what they said was that the biological evidence that he had adduced had very little relevance to human behavior. And yet these ideas still have an astonishing currency in academia. Evolutionary psychology, for example, is very much alive, and it's part of the same trend. And yes, well, we have made substantial progress in measuring physical signals in the brain, for example. But that doesn't justify the centuries-old just-so arguments and stories. The problem is that these arguments can be twisted to support practically anything. Next view graph, please. So I promised you that I'd say more about the faith side of things, and that's what I want to do before I wind up. And I thought I would do this by drawing what I take to be a genuine contrast between worldviews that are secular and the worldview of Christianity. Because I think it's a starting presumption of much secular argument in the intellectual West today, that there is no reality beyond that discovered by the natural sciences, and there is no good higher than the freedom of the individual. Now, science and individual freedom are both good, but Christians have a different view. We believe that both the deepest reality and the highest moral authority and good are found in loving relationships. We believe that the universe exists because a God who is love willed it and loves it. And we believe that individuals are loved by God and find their truest fulfillment in entering willingly into a relationship with Him and with one another. Now, we see around us that all is not love. There's a great deal of pain, alienation, anger, strife, and war. But Christians say that God has entered into the experience of His creatures in the person of a human, Jesus. And He has taken that alienation and pain upon Himself and at enormous cost overcome it. And that this stupendous redeeming act was taking place in front of practically the whole population of a small country, and that it echoes up and down the centuries. Now, this Christian worldview, Christian understanding of the world, is not scientific, but also it's not a foe of science. And so I'll come to my last view graph, please. That if we recognize that science has inherent limitations of scope, that its methods don't apply to many important aspects of the world, and if we distinguish science from scientism, that allows us to affirm the intellectually coherent approach that scientific and non-scientific descriptions can be simultaneously valid. So even if I do have a fairly comprehensive scientific explanation of some phenomenon, for example, the human person, there are still, or may well be still, important, crucially important aspects of that, which no amount of scientific progress is going to turn into natural sciences. For example, my thoughts. So it's vitally important to recognize that if I've got an explanation of a person in terms of atoms, it doesn't mean they're not a person. It doesn't mean the thoughts don't count. They still do count. So this idea that explanations at different levels can simultaneously be valid is an attitude that is, first of all, scriptural. I won't unpack this, but I'll give you a few references and we can talk about it later if you like. Secondly, it was historically practiced by the Christians of the scientific revolution and beyond, and they expressed it in terms of an analogy to two books. And it's philosophically necessary for, in any case, for all non-scientific disciplines, quite regardless of religion. But there is an inevitable rivalry between the worldviews of scientism and theism. And there's also a clash between scientism and there's a lot of other non-scientific disciplines. And Christianity, in common with most religious perspectives, cannot possibly accommodate scientism because that worldview rules out from the beginning personality and purpose, which are intrinsic to theism. So faith and science are not foes. And I think actually, while I wouldn't call them friends, because I think the more fruitful metaphor is to think of them as being more like brothers. Thank you very much.